Hey guys, tonight we step into the gritty, unglamorous world of a medieval castle, where stone walls echo with clinking armor, and the air's thick with smoke and secrets. Far from the fairy tale glow you might imagine, picture yourself trudging up a spiral staircase, your breath clouding in the chilly air, as torchlight flickers on damp walls crawling with moss. This isn't a Disney set. Life here is raw, crowded, and smells like wet wool and old stew. Want to know what it's really like? You're about to find out. But fair warning, surviving a day in this drafty, drama-filled fortress might be tougher than you think. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and local time. I'm curious where you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a northern English castle, 1380, where the moat glints under a gray sky and the drawbridge groans under carts of turnips. Mainstream history tells us castles were both fortresses and homes, housing lords, knights, servants, and their families in a chaotic mix of wealth and squalor. They weren't just for defense. They were bustling microcities with kitchens, stables, and chapels. But life inside was often cold, smelly, and cramped. You're in the Great Hall now, its high ceiling lost in shadows, the floor strewn with rushes that crunch under your boots. A lord, Sir William, sits at a raised table, his fur-lined cloak a stark contrast to the servants' threadbare tunics. You're handed a rough wool cloak, better than nothing, but it itches like a bad decision. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castle dwellers believed tossing fennel seeds into the hall's fire warded off malign spirits hiding in the smoke. You sniff the air, catching a whiff of burnt herbs, and smirk, spirits or not, it doesn't mask the smell of unwashed feet. Historians still argue whether castles were luxurious strongholds or barely livable prisons, with some saying lords lived in splendor, while others point to the grim conditions for most residents. You're leaning toward prison. The hall's drafty, and your cloak's not cutting it. You sidestep a servant hauling a wicker basket of bread, her face etched with exhaustion, and feel the castle's pulse spark grandeur, part grind. Joke number 1. If this hall was on Airbnb, it'd be listed as cozy with a chance of frostbite. The walls are hung with faded tapestries, their colors dulled by years of soot, and you hear the clatter of pots from the kitchen below. You're starting to see the divide: lords at the top, everyone else scrambling to keep the place running. You think of modern apartments with their thermostats and Wi-Fi, and almost laugh. This is survival, medieval style. The servant glances at you, offering a quick nod, and you wonder about her day, her life in these stones. Joke number 2. If castle life had a Yelp review, it'd be 5 stars for vibes, 1 for indoor plumbing. The hall's chill seeps into your bones, but there's a story in every shadow, and you're ready to dive deeper. You're still in the Great Hall of Sir William's castle, the itch of your wool cloak a constant nag as the faint fennel-scented smoke from the hearth curls upward, doing little to warm the cavernous space. The servants' footsteps echo, and you're here to navigate the drafty corridors, where meager fires offer scant relief from the medieval chill. Mainstream history tells us castles were notoriously cold, their thick stone walls trapping dampness, and their hearths when lit producing more smoke than heat, especially for those not seated at the lord's table. You're trudging down a narrow hallway, its walls slick with condensation, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and charred wood. Your boots slip on uneven flagstones, and you're clutching your cloak, wishing it was thicker as a gust from an arrow slit hits you like a slap. You pass a small fireplace, its flames pitiful, barely warming the guard slouched nearby. The smoke stings your eyes, curling up to the blackened ceiling, and you cough, wondering how anyone breathes in here. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castle folk stuffed their cloaks with straw, believing it caught the fire's spirit for extra warmth, though it mostly just made them smell like a barn. You imagine waddling around with a straw-stuffed cloak and smirk medieval insulation. 0 stars. Historians still argue whether Castle's cold was a design flaw or a deliberate choice, with some saying stone prioritized defense over comfort, while others think lords could have afforded better heating but didn't bother. You're leaning toward flaw. This hallway's an icebox, and even Sir William's fur cloak from the Great Hall wouldn't help much here. You think back to the hall's tapestries, their faded glory no match for the chill, and realize warmth's a luxury reserved for the elite. The guard mutters about another frozen night, his breath clouding, and you're starting to see why castle life wasn't all banquets and ballads. You try warming your hands by the fire, but it's like cozying up to a candle in a windstorm. The stakes are high. Without decent heat, illness festers, and you're not keen on catching medieval flu. You notice a servant hauling a wicker basket of kindling, her fingers red from the cold, and wonder how she endures this daily grind. You're impressed by their grit but daunted. Every step here feels like a battle with the elements. Joke number 1. If this fireplace was a Tinder match, it'd ghost you after one smoky date. You keep moving, the corridor twisting toward the kitchens, where you hope for a hint of warmth. The castle's a maze, each turn colder than the last, and you're starting to get why knights wore so many layers. Armor might actually be cozier than this cloak. You think of modern heaters, purring away, and almost laugh. This is raw, shivering survival. You're starting to see why fires were so precious, why every stick of wood was guarded like gold. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like fighting roommates over the thermostat in a drafty apartment. The hallway's chill bites deeper, but there's a story in every smoky breath, and you're ready to keep going. You've stumbled into the castle's bustling kitchen, the air a mix of simmering broth and the sharp tang of onions, a faint reprieve from the icy corridor's bite, though your wool cloak still itches like a bad rash. The smoky hearth from the hallway's still on your mind, but you're here to taste the stark divide in castle dining, where lords feast while others scrape by on scraps. Mainstream history tells us medieval castle diets were wildly unequal. Lords and their guests enjoyed lavish spreads of meat, bread, and wine, while servants and lower ranks made do with coarse porridge, stale bread, or leftovers if they were lucky. You're standing by a scarred wooden table, watching a cook, Agnes, stir a bubbling cauldron, her face flushed from the heat. Your stomach growls as you eye a tray of roasted venison destined for Sir William's table. But Agnes hands you a bowl of grayish pottage, its lumps uninviting. The kitchen's warm, but the class divide feels colder than the stone walls. You dip a wooden spoon into the pottage. It tastes like wet cardboard with a hint of turnip. The lords upstairs are carving into spiced boar, while you're here chewing grit. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some servants believed eating the crusts of the lord's bread gave them noble strength, a superstition that turned table scraps into a weird status symbol. You glance at the crusts Agnes is sweeping into a basket and smirk. Noble strength, sure, but it's still stale. Historians still argue whether this dining gap was purely economic or a deliberate power play, with some saying lords hoarded the best food to flaunt wealth. while others think it was just the reality of scarce resources. You're leaning toward power play. The venison's aroma is taunting you, and Sir William's not sharing. You think back to the smoky hallway, where even warmth was rationed, and see the same hierarchy here. Lords get the good stuff. Everyone else gets by. Agnes tosses you a heel of rye bread, hard as a rock, and you gnaw it, your jaw aching. The stakes are high. Poor food weakens the body, and servants like Agnes work grueling hours on this slop. You notice a scrawny boy, probably a kitchen hand, sneaking a scrap of fat from the venison tray, his eyes darting like a thief's. You're impressed by his nerve, but also feel the grind. Hunger's a constant shadow here. You try dipping the bread in the pottage, hoping for flavor, but it's like seasoning cardboard with sadness. You're starting to get why castle life wasn't all feasts and fanfare. You lean against the table, the cauldron's steam a fleeting comfort, the kitchen's chaos clanging pots. Agnes's sharp orders hums around you, but the divide between lord and servant is stark. You think of modern dining takeout, buffets, and almost laugh. This is survival, medieval style, with a side of class warfare. You're starting to see why food was power, why every crust mattered. You smirk, imagining a modern equivalent, like fighting over the last office donut while the boss hogs the catered lunch. The kitchen's warmth fades as you finish the pottage, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in the steamy chaos of the castle's kitchen, the pottage's bland aftertaste lingering like a bad memory, the venison's aroma mocking you as Agnes clangs pots, and the boy sneaks another scrap. Your wool cloaks damp from the heat, and you're here to labor with the overworked castle staff, whose endless toil keeps this stone heap running. Mainstream history tells us medieval castle servants, cooks, maids, stable hands worked grueling hours, performing backbreaking tasks like hauling water, scrubbing floors, and tending fires, often for little food or rest. You're handed a wicker basket by Agnes, who barks at you to fetch firewood from the courtyard, her eyes sharp with exhaustion. You trudge toward the door, the kitchen's warmth fading as a blast of cold air hits you. The courtyard a gray expanse of mud and your boots squelch, and you're already dreading the weight of the logs. The firewood peels half buried in snow, and you start stacking logs, your hands stinging as the bark scrapes your skin. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some servants believed singing while working lightened the load, claiming it pleased spirits who'd ease their tasks. You hum a tune, feeling ridiculous, and smirk. Spirits or not, these logs aren't getting lighter. Historians still argue whether servants' long hours were a product of feudal necessity or deliberate exploitation, with some saying castles needed constant labor to function, while others think lords overworked staff to reinforce power. You're leaning toward exploitation. Agnes's haggard face and the boy's sneaky grabs suggest they're stretched thin. You heave a log into the basket, your back protesting, and glance at a stable hand mucking out stalls nearby, his breath clouding in the cold. You think back to the pottage's meager sustenance, barely fuel for this kind of work, and realize the staff's toil is the castle's unseen engine. The courtyard's a hive of activity maids hauling laundry, a blacksmith hammering, and you're struck by how everyone's labor props up Sir William's cushy life. In the Great Hall, the stakes are high. A missed task could mean a lashing or less food, and there's no medieval HR to complain to. You try lifting the basket, but it's heavy, and you nearly tip into the mud. Agnes would probably laugh, but you're not cut out for this grind. You're starting to see why servants were the castle's backbone, their sweat holding up the stones. Joke number 1. If this job had a LinkedIn profile, It'd list multitasking under duress as a top skill. You stagger back toward the kitchen, the basket digging into your shoulder. The castle's hierarchy feels sharper now, lord's feast, servant slave, and you're just trying not to drop the wood. You think of modern workplaces, coffee breaks, ergonomic chairs, and almost laugh. This is raw, relentless work, medieval style. You're impressed by the staff's endurance but daunted. Every log is a reminder of their unseen struggle. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like being the intern who refills the office printer while the CEO naps. The courtyards. Chill bites deeper, but there's a story in every strained muscle, and you're ready to keep going. You're back in the castle's kitchen, the firewood basket from the courtyard now dumped by the hearth. Your shoulders aching as Agnes gives you a curt nod before turning back to her cauldron. The pottage's faint warmth is long gone, and you're here to face the grim reality of castle sanitation, where chamber pots and filthy floors make cleanliness a distant dream. Mainstream history tells us medieval castles were notoriously dirty, with no proper plumbing. Waste was collected in pots, dumped in moats, or left to fester, and floors were strewn with rushes that hid grime and vermin. You're handed a chipped clay chamber pot by a maid, Ellen, who points you toward a cramped sleeping chamber off the great hall, her face wrinkled with disgust. The air's thick with the stench of old food and something worse, and you're clutching your wool cloak, wishing it could block the smell as you step into the dim room. The chamber's floor is a mess of soiled rushes, crunching under your boots, and the pot's already half full. Yep, this is your job now. You gag, holding it at arm's length. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castle folk sprinkled dried lavender in chamber pots, believing it purified the vapors and pleased spirits. You sniff the air, catching no lavender, just a whiff of despair, and smirk. Spirits must be on vacation. Historians still argue whether this filth was accepted as normal or a health crisis waiting to happen, with some saying medieval people were used to the mess, while others think it bred disease that wiped out half the castle. You're leaning toward crisis. This room's a biohazard, and you're not signing up for medieval janitor duty. You set the pot down, careful not to spill, and spot a rat scurrying through the rushes. Great roommates. You think back to the servants' toil in the courtyard, their labor keeping the castle alive, and realize sanitation's another thankless task, often left to the lowest maids like Ellen. The stakes are high. Poor hygiene could spark illness, and there's no medieval CVS for antibiotics. You try sweeping the rushes with a twig broom Ellen hands you, but it just stirs up dust and a smell like expired yogurt. You recall Sir William's fur-lined cloak in the great hall, probably far from this stench, and feel the class divide. Lords get tapestries, you get pots. You're impressed by Ellen's grim determination as she empties another pot into a bucket, her hands chapped from the cold. You're starting to see why castle life wasn't all chivalry. It was a daily wrestle with filth. Joke number 1. If this chamber was a spa, its signature treatment would be OD misery. You stumble back to the kitchen, the empty pot swinging, the castle's grime clinging to your boots. The contrast between the Lord's table and this reality is stark, and you're wondering how anyone stayed healthy or sane. You think of modern plumbing, hot showers, flush toilets, and almost laugh. This is survival, medieval style, with a side of stench. You're starting to get why cleanliness was a luxury, why every clean rush was a small victory. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like cleaning a frat house bathroom after a party and calling it character building. The kitchen's heat is a faint relief, but the chamber's smell lingers, and you're ready to keep going. You're back in the castle's kitchen, the chamber pot stench still clinging to your cloak like a bad memory. The faint warmth from Agnes's cauldron a small comfort, as you dodge a scrawny kitchen boy darting past with a tray of bread, crusts. Your boots are caked with Russia's grime, and you're here to don heavy armor, stepping into the grueling world of a knight's training where the weight of steel is as punishing as the castle's cold. Mainstream history tells us medieval knights wore armor weighing 50 to 70 pounds, a mix of chainmail and plate that protected but exhausted them, requiring constant practice to move, fight, or even stand upright. You're trudging to the castle's training yard, where a grizzled armorer, Hugh, hands you a rusted hauberk, its iron rings jingling like loose change. The yard's a muddy patch ringed by stone walls, the air sharp with frost and the clang of practice swords. And you're already sweating as you pull the chainmail over your itchy wool tunic. The hauberk's weight drags your shoulders, each step a slog, and Hugh straps a dented breastplate on you, tightening it until you can barely breathe. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some knights believed rubbing their armor with sage leaves brought luck in battle, a ritual to charm the steel itself. You glance at the muddy ground. No sage in sight, and Smirkluck's not helping you lift this thing. Historians still argue whether armor's burden was a necessary evil for survival, or a status symbol that glorified suffering, with some saying it was essential for combat, while others think it was over-engineered to flaunt wealth. You're leaning towards suffering, your knees are buckling, and you haven't even swung a sword yet. You try a practice lunge, as Hugh barks, and nearly topple into the mud. Knight life's not as glamorous as the tapestries make it seem. You think back to the filthy chamber, where servants like Ellen wrestled with grime, and see a parallel. Everyone here's carrying a load, whether it's pots or plate armor. The stakes are high. A knight too weak to move in this gear could die in battle. And you're not exactly Sir Lancelot material. You notice a young squire, barely 15, struggling with his own armor, his face red from effort. You're impressed by his grit but daunted. This training's a marathon, and you're winded from one step. You recall Sir William's fur-lined cloak in the Great Hall, probably never touching the steel, and feel the Divide Lord's command. Knights endure. You swing a blunted sword, Hugh tosses you, and your arm screams yep. You're sticking to pottage duty. You're starting to see why knighthood was a grind, not a fairy tale. Joke number 1. If armor was a gym membership, it'd be the one you regret signing up for. You stagger to a bench, the armor clanking, the yard's noise clangs, shouts, grunts ringing in your ears. The castle's hierarchy feels heavier. Now, knights training for glory while servants scrub and sweat. You think of modern workouts, yoga, spin class, and almost laugh. This is medieval CrossFit, with a side of mortal peril. You're starting to get why armor was both shield and shackle. Why every knight was a walking fortress. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like lugging a treadmill to work for authenticity. The yard's chill bites through the steel, but there's a story in every creak, and you're ready to keep going. You're staggering out of the training yard, the armor's weight still aching in your shoulders. The clang of swords fading as you re-enter the castle's dim corridors, the air thick with mildew, and the faint smoke from that pitiful hearth you passed earlier. Your wool cloak's damp with sweat, and you're here to overhear whispers. The gossip that swirls through these stone halls, shaping the politics and power plays of medieval castle life. Mainstream history tells us castles were hotbeds of intrigue, where rumors about alliances, betrayals, or the Lord's favor could shift fortunes faster than a sword. You're slinking along a shadowed hallway, its walls hung with faded tapestries. When you catch hushed voices behind a wooden door, you pause, ear pressed to the oak. As the servants, Marjorie and Thomas, murmur about Sir William's latest spat with a neighboring baron, the corridor's cold, but the gossip's heat draws you in. Like eavesdropping on a medieval soap opera, Marjorie's voice is low, saying the baron's daughter spurns Sir William's son, sparking talk of a feud or, worse, a raid. Thomas whispers that a knight's been seen sneaking to the ladies' chambers, and bets are on a scandal. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castle folk believed whispering secrets near a hearth sent them to spirits, who'd carry the gossip to allies or enemies. You glance at the nearest fireplace. Its embers dead, and smirk hope no spirits heard. That one. Historians still argue whether gossip was a tool for survival or a dangerous game, with some saying it helped servants navigate power, while others think it fueled mistrust and backstabbing. You're leaning toward survival. Marjorie's tone suggests she's trading info to stay one step ahead. You shift, the floor creaking, and the voices hush-oops. Stealth's not your forte. You think back to the armorer's yard, where knights bore their steel burdens, and see gossip as another weight, carried by those weaving the castle's web. The stakes are high. A wrong rumor could cost a servant their place, or worse, spark a feud that burns the whole valley. You recall the pottage's grim divide in the kitchen, how servants like Agnes survived on scraps, and realize gossips, their currency knowledge traded for favor or protection. You inch away from the door, catching a glimpse of Marjorie slipping out, her eyes sharp, probably sizing you up as a loose end. You're impressed by her cunning but nervous. One wrong word, and you're the talk of the hall. You're starting to see why whispers were as potent as swords. Why every ear was a battlefield. You try blending into the shadows, but your cloak snags on a tapestry smooth move. The corridor's chill wraps around you, the tapestry's faded threads swaying slightly. The castle's pulse labor. Hunger. Now secrets feels alive in these walls, and you're wondering who's whispering about you. You think of modern drama office rumors, group chats, and almost laugh. This is medieval shade, thrown with higher stakes. You're starting to get why gossip shaped the castle, why every hushed word carried weight. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like a viral tweet stirring up the company's Slack. The hallway's gloom deepens, but there's a story in every whisper, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in the castle's shadowy corridor, the echo of Marjorie's gossip about Sir William's feud lingering like the mildew on the tapestries. The cold stone under your boots, a stark reminder of the armor's weight you shed in the training yard. Your wool cloak still damp, and you're here to explore the confined lives of noble women, whose daily routines in the castle were far less glamorous than the ballads suggest. Mainstream history tells us medieval noble women, like Lady Eleanor, Sir William's wife, were often restricted to domestic roles, managing households, sewing, or praying, trapped by rigid expectations despite their status. You're slipping into the solar, a small chamber where Eleanor and her ladies sit by a narrow window, their needles flashing as they embroider linens, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax, candles, and lavender. Your cloak snags on a wooden stool, and you settle near Eleanor, her face calm but her eyes restless, like a bird in a gilded cage. Eleanor's stitching a tapestry, its threads depicting a hunt, but her movements are mechanical, her day a cycle of needlework, prayers, and overseeing servants like Agnes from the kitchen. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some noble women hid secret messages in their embroidery, using stitches to encode pleas or gossip, a subtle rebellion against their confines. You imagine Eleanor sewing "Help, I'm bored" into a deer's flank and smirk crafty, literally, Historians still argue whether noble women's restricted lives were a cultural norm or a deliberate control tactic, with some saying it reflected medieval gender roles, while others think lords like Sir William limited their wives to curb political influence. You're leaning toward control. Eleanor's gaze keeps flicking to the window, as if she's plotting an escape to the muddy courtyard beyond. You think back to the whispered gossip about the Baron's daughter, how it stirred the castle's politics, and realize Eleanor's probably heard it too, but her role keeps her silent. Her power confined to these walls. The stakes are high. A misstep, say, meddling in Sir William's feud could tarnish her reputation, or worse, spark a scandal. You try threading a needle to join the ladies, but your fingers fumble, and a younger lady, Beatrice, stifles a laugh. You're impressed by Eleanor's poise, managing this stifling routine with grace. But you're also daunted. Her life's a velvet prison, no less grueling than the servant's toil. You recall the filthy chamber pots, the knight's armor, and see a pattern. Everyone's bound by the castle's rules, just in different cages. You're starting to see why noble women's lives were less lady of the manor, and more trapped in a tower. Joke number 1. If Eleanor's Day was a Netflix series, it'd be called Stitch and Sigh, the Medieval Diaries. You shift on the stool. The solar's warmth from a small brazier a rare treat, but the room feels stifling in its own way. The ladies chatter muted by propriety. You think of modern freedom's careers, travel and almost laugh. This is medieval high society, with all the fun of a convent. You're starting to get why Eleanor's needlework is her battlefield. Why every stitch is a quiet act of endurance. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like being stuck in a Zoom meeting all day with no mute button. The solar's candlelight flickers, and you're ready to keep going. You're slipping out of the solar. Eleanor's restless gaze and the faint hum of her lady's needles still lingering. As you step back into the castle's chilly corridors, the mildew scent hitting you like a damp slap after the lavender-tinged air. Your wool cloak starting to feel like a permanent fixture, and you're here to man the castle's walls, where constant fear of siege keeps everyone on edge, revealing the defensive reality of medieval life. Mainstream history tells us castles were built for protection. Their high walls, arrow slits, and portcullises designed to fend off invaders. But the threat of attack, whether from rival lords or roving bandits, meant guards and residents lived in a state of heightened alertness. You're climbing a narrow, spiraling staircase to the battlements, your boots scraping on worn stone. The wind's howl growing louder as you emerge onto the parapet. The air's sharp with frost, and you're gripping a wooden spear handed to you by a grizzled guard, Ralph, who's scanning the horizon for trouble. The view's stunning, rolling hills dusted with snow, but the tension's thicker than the castle's walls. You peer through an arrow slit, the distant forest a blur of bare branches, and Ralph mutters about a scout spotting riders yesterday. Maybe the Baron from Marjorie's gossip. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some guards believe tying a raven's feather to their spear warded off enemy arrows, a charm for battlefield luck. You finger the spear, no feathers in sight, and smirk. Guess you're relying on Ralph's aim instead. Historians still argue whether this constant siege fear was justified or exaggerated, with some saying castles were rarely attacked due to their strength, while others think the threat was real, keeping residents on perpetual high alert. You're leaning toward real. Ralph's eyes are hard, his hand never leaving his sword, and you're feeling exposed up here, the wind cutting through your cloak like a blade. You think back to Eleanor's confined solar, her needlework a quiet cage, and see the contrast her prisons indoors. Yours is this windy perch, both shaped by the castle's demands. The stakes are high. A missed signal or a lazy watch could let invaders breach the walls. And you're not keen on starring in a medieval massacre. You try holding the spear steady, but it's heavy, and your arms ache from the memory of that. Armor in the training yard. Ralph points to a signal fire on a distant hill, his jaw tightening. Friend or foe? No one's sure. You're impressed by his vigilance but rattled. Every shadow feels like a threat now. You're starting to see why castle life was less about glory and more about survival. Why every guard was a human alarm system. You're tempted to duck behind the parapet, but Ralph's glare keeps you upright. Joke number 1. If this wall was a job posting, it'd read great views. Constant paranoia required. You shift, the stone icy under your boots, the castles. Pulse gossip, labor, now defense beating in every gust. You think of modern security cameras, alarms, and almost laugh. This is raw, spear-clutching vigilance, medieval style. You're starting to get why fear shaped the castle, why every lookout was a lifeline. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like guarding your apartment with a baseball bat during a blackout. The wind's bite sharpens, but there's a story in every creaking beam, and you're ready to keep going. You're descending from the battlements, the wind's icy sting still prickling your skin as Ralph's tense watch over the snowy hills fades behind you, the castle's stone staircase spiraling into a warmer but still drafty great hall. Your wool cloaks damp from the parapet's frost, and you're here to join a lavish banquet, where feasts mask the food scarcity that haunts even this medieval fortress. Mainstream history tells us castle feasts were spectacles of wealth, with lords like Sir William hosting tables groaning under roasted meats, spiced pies, and wine to impress guests. But behind the excess, food shortages loomed, especially in winter when stores dwindled. You're ushered to a lower bench in the great hall, its walls aglow with torchlight, as servants haul in platters for the high table where Sir William and Lady Eleanor preside. The air's thick with the aroma of venison and cloves, but you're handed a trencher of stale bread and a thin slice of fatty mutton, a far cry from the lord's spread. You poke at the mutton, its gristle chewy, while Sir William carves into a swan pie, its crust golden. The contrast stings, just like the pottage you choked down in the kitchen. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castle folk believed eating peacock at a feast brought prosperity, a superstition that justified slaughtering rare birds for show. You eye the peacock platter at the high table and smirk. Prosperity's not trickling down to your trencher. Historians still argue whether feasts were genuine abundance or a facade, with some saying they drained scarce resources to flaunt power, while others think they were strategic, binding allies with generosity. You're leaning toward facade. The servants' hurried glances suggest the pantry's not as full as the table looks. You nibble the bread, its crust like cardboard, and wonder how much grain's left for spring. You think back to the parapets, tension, where siege fears kept Ralph on edge, and see this feast as another kind of defense, a show of strength to mask vulnerability. The stakes are high. A lean winter could starve the castle, and Sir William's lavish spread feels like a gamble to keep guests loyal. You notice Agnes from the kitchen, now serving wine, her face taut as she rations pours for the lower tables. You're impressed by the castle's ability to stage this excess, but uneasy. Every bite you take is one less for someone like her. You try sipping the watered-down ale, its taste flat, and recall the gossip about a baron's feud. Maybe this feast is Sir William's way of flexing muscle. You're starting to see why banquets were less about joy and more about politics. Why every dish was a calculated move. Joke number 1. If this feast was a budget, it'd be all flex, no funds. You shift on the bench. The hall's noise loots. Laughter. Clinking goblets swirling around you. The castle's hierarchy feels sharper here. Lords gorging while you scrape your trencher. You think of modern buffets, endless pizza, soda fountains, and almost laugh. This is medieval flexing, with a side of hunger pangs. You're starting to get why feasts hid scarcity. Why every peacock pie was a lie. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like posting a gourmet Instagram meal while your fridge holds only ketchup packets. The hall's torchlight flickers, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in the great hall, the banquet's clamor lutes strumming. Sir William's laughter booming, fading as you push away your trencher's gristly mutton. The peacock pea's fleeting aroma, a cruel reminder of the castle's divided tables. Your will cloak stiff with dried sweat, and you're here to witness the grip of religion in the castle's chapel, where priests wield power over hearts and minds in this medieval world. Mainstream history tells us religion was central to castle life, with chapels serving as spiritual hubs where lords, knights, and servants sought divine favor through prayers, masses, and confessions, often guided by priests who held sway over moral and political decisions. You're shuffling out of the hall, following a stream of castle folk to the chapel, a stone chamber lit by flickering candles, its air heavy with incense and the faint damp of old walls. You kneel on a cold flagstone beside Agnes, the kitchen cook, her hands clasped as a priest. Father Gerard intones Latin from a carved pulpit, his voice echoing like a storm. The chapel's walls are painted with vivid saints, their eyes judging you as you shift, your knees aching. Father Gerard's sermon warns of sin, his gaze lingering on the highborn like Lady Eleanor, who kneels near the altar in a velvet gown. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castle folk believed lighting a candle with a coin tucked beneath it ensured God's ear, a bribe for divine attention. You glance at a candle by the altar, no coin in sight, and smirk. Guess you're praying for free. Historians still argue whether religion unified the castle or reinforced its hierarchy, with some saying shared faith bridged class divides, while others think priests used it to control the masses for lords like Sir William. You're leaning toward control. Father Gerard's sermon feels like a leash, keeping everyone in line. You clasp your hands, mimicking Agnes, but your mind's on the banquet's excess, hard to feel holy with an empty stomach. You think back to the feast's facade, how it hid scarcity, and see the chapel as another stage, where piety masks power. Plays. The stakes are high. A priest's disapproval could shame a knight or sway Sir William's alliances. Maybe even that baron's feud from the gossip. You notice a young squire, fresh from the training yard, whispering a confession to a junior priest, his face pale, probably scared of hell more than swords. You're impressed by the chapel's hold, drawing everyone from lords to lowborn, but uneasy. Father Gerard's authority feels as heavy as the armor you wore. You try praying, but the Latin's a blur, and you're distracted by Agnes's fervent murmurs. You're starting to see why religion was the castle's heartbeat, why every candle and chant mattered. You're tempted to sneak a coin under a candle, just in case. Joke number 1. If this chapel was an app, it'd be papal. Buy one blessing, get one guilt-free. You shift, the flagstones numbing your knees, the incense swirling like a fog. The castle's pulse feasts, gossip, now faith beats in these walls, and you're wondering how much of Agnes's devotion is hope versus fear. You think of modern churches' heated pews, upbeat hymns, and almost laugh. This is raw, bone-chilling worship, medieval style. You're starting to get why priests held such sway, why their words were as sharp as any blade. You smirk, picturing A modern equivalent, like a viral sermon clip blowing up on TikTok. The chapel's glow dims, and you're ready to keep going. You're slipping out of the chapel, Father Gerard's Latin chants still ringing in your ears as the incense's heavy sweetness clings to your wool cloak. The cold flagstones ache lingering in your knees. The castle's dim corridors feel sharper after the chapel's glow. And you're here to see the lives of young nobles, whose playtime in this medieval fortress masks harsh lessons in duty and survival. Mainstream history tells us children of lords, like Sir William's son, Edmund, and daughter, Cecily, were raised with strict training: boys for knighthood or governance, girls for marriage and household management, blending games with grueling preparation for their roles. You're wandering into the castle's inner courtyard, a muddy square where Edmund, about 12, practices swordplay with a wooden blade, while Cecily, a year younger, watches from a bench, her hands busy with a spindle. The air's crisp, tinged with smoke and horse dung, and your boots sink into the slush as you dodge a stray practice swing from Edmund. Edmund's strikes are clumsy but fierce, guided by a stern knight who barks corrections, his wooden sword clacking against a shield. Cecily's spindle whirs, her face set as she spins coarse wool, her play a lesson in future duties. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castle children believed hiding a pebble in their shoe during training pleased warrior saints, granting skill or luck. You notice Edmund's limp and smirk: pebble or bad aim. He's not winning any tournaments yet. Historians still argue whether noble children's training was effective preparation or overly harsh, with some saying it built resilience, while others think it robbed them of childhood for political ends. You're leaning toward harsh. Edmund's panting, and Cecily's fingers are red from the spindle, their games feeling more like boot camp than fun. You think back to the chapel's rigid prayers, how faith controlled even the devout like Agnes, and see a parallel. Edmund and Cecily are molded by the castle's expectations, their futures set in stone like the walls around you. The stakes are high. A weak heir could doom Sir William's line, and a poorly trained daughter might fail to secure a marriage alliance, maybe even with that baron from the gossip. You try swinging a spare wooden sword, but it's heavier than it looks, and Edmund snickers, his bravado masking exhaustion. You're impressed by their grit but unsettled. They're kids, yet the castle's already shaping them into pawns. You recall the feast's success, a world they'll inherit, and wonder if they'll ever taste the pottage's grim reality. You're starting to see why childhood here was less about play and more about preparation. Why every swing or stitch was a step toward duty. You're tempted to toss Cecily a softer thread, but her knightly overseer's watching. You lean against a barrel. The courtyard's noise clacks, shouts, the spindles hum swirling around you. The castle's pulse feasts, faith, now training beats in these young lives. And you're wondering how much of their spark survives this grind. You think of modern childhood video games, school plays, and almost laugh. This is medieval upbringing with a side of sword play. You're starting to get why their lessons were so intense. Why every child was a cog in the castle's machine. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like signing kids up for CEO camp at age 10. The courtyard's chill bites, but there's a story in every swing, and you're ready to keep going. You're trudging out of the muddy courtyard, Edmund's wooden sword clacks and Cecily's spindle hum fading. As you re-enter the castle's stone corridors, the chill wrapping around you like a damp shroud after the open air. Your wool cloaks, heavy with slush, and you're here to endure winter's brutal bite, where the castle's thick walls offer little comfort against a season that tests even the hibern. Mainstream history tells us medieval castles were freezing in winter. There, stone retaining cold like a grudge, with scarce firewood and poor insulation making life miserable for lords and servants alike. You're shuffling into a lesser hall, where a meager fire sputters in a blackened hearth, its smoke curling up to the rafters. Sir William huddles near it, his fur-lined cloak no match for the frost, while servants like Agnes shiver at the room's edges, their breath clouding in the dim light. The air smells of charred wood and damp wool, and you're clutching your cloak, wishing for the solar's brazier you glimpsed with Lady Eleanor. You edge closer to the fire, its heat barely reaching your fingers, the hall's high windows letting in drafts that swirl snowflakes onto the rush-strewn floor. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castle folk believed rubbing salt on their hands drew fire's spirit to warm them, a ritual as useless as it sounds. You rub your palms, no salt in sight, and smirk still freezing, no spirits invited. Historians still argue whether winter's hardship unified the castle's residents or widened their divides, with some saying shared suffering brought lords and servants closer, while others think the elite hoarded warmth, leaving the rest to freeze. You're leaning toward divides, Sir William's hogging the fire, and Agnes's chapped hands tell a colder story. You try warming your boots by the hearth, but the flames are weak, and you're starting to feel like a human icicle. You think back to Edmund's training, his childhood shaped by duty, and see winter as another test, forcing everyone to ration resources: wood, food, hope. The stakes are high. A harsh winter could sicken the castle, and with no medieval urgent care, a cough like Tom's from the peasant hut could turn deadly here too. You notice a servant piling straw under a bench for extra insulation, a trick you recognize from patching Alice's hut walls. You're impressed by their resourcefulness but daunted. Even this fortress, with its feasts and priests, bows to winter's wrath. You recall the banquet's peacock pie, a lie of plenty, and realize the pantry's probably as low as the firewood. You're starting to see why winter was the castle's true siege, why every ember was a battle. You're tempted to steal Sir William's spot, but his glare says try it, peasant. Joke number 1. If this hearth was a heater, it'd be stuck on tease mode. You shift, the rushes crunching under your boots, the hall's gloom pressing in, the castle's pulse gossip, faith, training slows in winter, everyone focused on survival. You think of modern winter's cozy blankets, hot cocoa, and almost laugh. This is medieval endurance, with a side of frostbite. You're starting to get why warmth was a luxury, why every fire was a fleeting victory. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like camping in a blizzard with a single match and calling it rustic. The hall's chill deepens, but there's a story in every shiver, and you're ready to keep going. You're shuffling out of the lesser hall, the feeble hearth's smoke still stinging your eyes. Sir William's fur-lined cloak a fading image, as the castle's winter chill clings to your damp wool cloak like a stubborn guest. The corridors, icy drafts nip at your ears, and you're here to hear tales from traveling bards, whose songs and stories bring news and fleeting escape to this medieval fortress. Mainstream history tells us bards and minstrels were vital in medieval castles, roaming from court to court with lutes and gossip, sharing tales of distant lands, heroic deeds, or local scandals that kept isolated residents connected to the wider world. You're squeezing into the great hall again, now dimmer as evening falls, its rush-strewn floor packed with castle folk servants, knights. Even Lady Eleanor gathered around a weary bard named Giles, his lute strings glinting in the torchlight. The air smells of tallow candles and sour ale, and you're settling on a bench beside Agnes, her face softening as Giles strums a melancholy tune about a lost night. Giles's voice weaves a story of a Welsh castle's fall, his words painting battles and betrayals so vividly you almost forget the hall's chill. He slips in news a baron's raid nearby, maybe the one from Marjorie's gossip, masking it as a tale to dodge Sir William's glare. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some bards claimed their songs could summon fair winds to ease winters. Grip, a charm castle folk tipped extra for. You glance at the snow-dusted windows and smirk. Giles's lute isn't thawing anything tonight. Historians still argue whether bards were mere entertainers or key informants, with some saying their stories were frivolous, while others think they shaped alliances and morale. You're leaning toward informants. Giles's sly nod to a servant suggests he's trading secrets for coin. You tap your foot to the rhythm, but your frozen toes protest maybe you're not cut out for medieval concerts. You think back to Winter's Bite in the Lesser Hall, how it tested everyone, and see Giles's songs as a rare warmth, lifting spirits. Where fires failed, the stakes are high. A good tale could rally the castle or stir unrest, especially with that baron's raid looming. You notice Edmund, the young noble, wide-eyed at Giles's war story, probably dreaming of knighthood, while Cecily hums along, her spindle idle for once. You're impressed by Giles's knack for holding this motley crowd, but uneasy. His news about raids feels too close to Ralph's signal fire on the battlements. You try clapping along, but your hands are stiff from the cold, and Agnes elbows you to hush apparently. You're no bard's backup. You're starting to see why minstrels were the castle's lifeline to the outside. Why every note carried weight. You're tempted to ask Giles about the Baron, but his sharp glance says pay for secrets. Joke number 1. If Giles was a news app, he'd charge per strum and crash on updates. You lean back, the bench creaking. The hall's hum lutes, murmurs, clinking cups wrapping you in its rhythm. The castle's pulse feasts. Faith, winter vibrates in Giles's chords, and you're wondering what truths hide in his next verse. You think of modern media podcasts, X-posts, and almost laugh. This is medieval Wi-Fi, slow but spellbinding. You're starting to get why bards mattered, why their tales were as vital as bread. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like a YouTuber dropping tea in a live stream to a hyped chat. The hall's torchlight dims, and you're ready to keep going. You're still in the Great Hall, Giles's lute fading into a soft hum as his tale of raids and lost nights lingers. The torchlight casting long shadows across the rush-strewn floor, where Agnes and young Edmund sit, wrapped, your wool cloaks, heavy with the castle's damp, and you're here to reflect on the gritty reality of medieval castle life as winter's grip eases, and spring's promise whispers through the stones. Mainstream history tells us castles were complex ecosystems, part fortress, part village where lords, servants, knights, and children lived in a tense balance of power, labor, and survival. Their stories enduring in chronicles and ruins. You're leaning against a pillar, the hall quieter now, the crowd thinning as servants like Agnes slip away to their tasks. Outside, the snow's melting, dripping from the battlements you patrolled, and the air smells of wet earth and faint hope. A sign the castle's endured another season. You're holding a chipped wooden cup of ale, its taste flat but grounding, feeling the weight of this world's contradictions, glory and grime, feasts and filth. You glance at Lady Eleanor, lingering near the high table, her face softer as she watches the last stragglers. The castle's pulse its smoky hearths, whispered gossip, children's training beats in her quiet presence, in Agnes's worn hands, in Giles's fading chords. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castle folk believe spring's first dawn cleansed the walls of winter's curses, prompting a ritual sweep of rushes to welcome renewal. You imagine Agnes broom in hand, banishing curses with a smirk, and grin spring cleaning, medieval style. Historians still argue whether castle life's legacy lies in its grandeur or its resilience, with some saying it shaped chivalric ideals, while others think it was the unsung labor of servants that truly endured. You're leaning toward resilience, Eleanor's poise, Agnes's grit, Edmund's swordplay. They're the castle's heart, not its stone. You think back to the chapel's prayers, the banquet's facade, the battlements, fear each a thread in a tapestry of survival, woven through winter's cold. The stakes were high. Every fire, every tale, every stitch held this place together, a fragile shield against chaos. You recall the filthy chamber pots, the armor's weight, and marvel at how they thrived amid such hardship. The hall's warmth is fading, but the promise of spring green fields, full pantries lifts the gloom, a reward for their endurance. You're impressed by their legacy, not just in surviving but in building a world where community outlasted the frost. You sip the ale, its bitterness softening, and wonder if Eleanor dreams of a freer life beyond these walls. You're starting to see why castle life was no fairy tale, but a raw, vibrant struggle that echoes still. You're tempted to join Agnes's rush-sweeping ritual, but your cloak's heavy enough. You settle on the bench, the pillar's cool stone steadying you, the castle's hum creaking beams, distant footsteps fading into a gentle rhythm. You think of modern homes cozy, connected, and see faint echoes of this hall's strange, stubborn warmth. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like a neighborhood rallying after a storm, sharing stories over coffee. The torches sputter, and you're ready to let this world drift, its lessons as lasting as spring's first bloom. Wind down, you're resting now, the great hall melting into a soft haze, the rush floor's crunch fading to a whisper. The castle's weight, it's cold. Stones, smoky fires, whispered tales dissolves, leaving only the murmur of spring and the calm of a world turning anew. You're safe here, wrapped in the quiet of a place that fought and flourished, its resilience glowing like embers in your mind. Let your breathing slow, each exhale gentle and unhurried, your body sinking into the bench's embrace. The stories of Eleanor, Agnes, and Giles linger, but they're distant now, blending into the dawn's tender light. You don't need to hold them. The hall's chill fades, the air grows still, and you're drifting, carried by a peace as steady as spring's return. Sleep's waiting, soft and certain, ready to cradle you like a castle's enduring heart. Close your eyes, let go, and rest.